This is the fifth video lecture on the topic of socialization, and in this one we're going to talk about socialization across the life course. I kind of hinted at this in a previous lecture, but the idea is basically that as we come of age, as we grow up, we are socialized, we learn different ways of being at different stages. That's all we mean. Socialization through the life course. So we talk about these different stages of the life course. So think of it like this is a toddler, a child, can act differently than an adult. But the question is, or the fun question is, when are you an adult? And what does it mean to be a child? So we sociologists say that these different stages of the life course, they're completely, we're talking from a sociological perspective, they're completely social, they're completely arbitrary, right? But we base them loosely, they're loosely biologically based because they're based on your biological years, like how many years have you been outside your mother's womb, right? How many years has your being been alive? But it's society that determines when you transition from an adolescent to an adult, or when you transition from a young adult to a middle-aged adult, right? That's society. And it is society socially decided what that means. Are you old? Are you young? How are you supposed to act? How is somebody in late adulthood, how are they supposed to act, and what is normal for them, right? Because you remember in the chapter on culture, when we talked about norms are just patterns of behavior that everyone basically agrees on. Okay, so we're talking about age-related transition points. Transition points when we go from child to adult. The age norms or time-related rules and regulations. Again, what is acceptable for the stage of life that you are in? Interesting, when we talk about childhood, this is actually a topic that I kind of like talking about, but when we talk about childhood is not is a relatively modern concept. That if you look historically at pictures of children, so one of the distinctions about children in our culture, well, biological children, is their heads are disproportionately larger than the rest of their bodies. But when you look at artwork, ancient artwork, we don't see children presented or illustrated as if they were somehow unique with their heads disproportionate. And so historians have argued that suggests that children were not seen as unique and special. So in our culture, we talk about childhood as special and it should be protected, and children, their work is their play. Historically, that was probably certainly not for Europeans. That was certainly not the case. Is that we put children to work in factories right away. We didn't think of them as special, right? But now we understand that their brains are different. Then we move into adolescence, and adolescence is not even a cultural universal. In some parts of the world and among some human groups, you go from child to adult. There's no transitionary period. Some argue that the reason, and now we're talking about, so the textbooks say adolescence is the time of puberty, so when your body starts to change, until about 25, right? Is that right? Until about 25. So now when we talk about adolescence, sometimes, okay, so I lost my train. But the notion that adolescence is this difficult time, some argue it's because we don't really, when you're, say, go back to 8th, 9th grade, you were told to act your age probably, but what exactly does that mean, right? So in some cultures, in some family cultures, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old is considered to do a lot, and they're considered or expected to contribute maybe even to the household budget, where in other households, that 15, 16-year-old is treated still more like a child. So there can be a significant difference from one family group or from one culture to another group, how somebody who is in this period between puberty and 25 in adolescence, how they are treated, what privileges they're given. In the Human Growth book, they talk about that people who had a lot of independence during adolescence are more likely to think about adolescence positively than people who didn't have the same privileges. And I know, at least for me, there was this big difference. Some of us in middle school had lots of freedom, and others didn't have very much freedom at all. Then you move to young adulthood. So young adulthood is thought to be between about 25, actually, and I believe middle adulthood is 45. This is getting longer and longer. We could say it's because Americans are wealthy and they can afford to live in their parents' basement, or you could say that Americans are struggling financially and they can't afford to get out of their basement. It kind of depends on which angle. One way is that so my 30-year-old son still lives in our basement, and part of the reason he does is because his standard of living, like the way he likes to spend his money on toys and video games and eating out and taking trips, he probably could not afford to live like that if he lived on his own. So on one hand, he lives with us because he doesn't have enough money. On the other hand, he lives with us because we as a household are affluent enough to continue to let him live with us, and we don't need him to financially contribute to our household. So it all kind of depends on which way you sort of interpret it. But the reality is that people are marrying later and later and later. Actually, they're marrying less and less too. But now I think it is 27. I think the median age for men first married is 27, and for girls it's 24. Middle adulthood. So middle adulthood is that 45 to, I'm not sure, maybe 75. I'm not sure which textbook. It depends on what late adulthood is. You've heard of something called the midlife crisis. This is the point in our life where maybe our children leave our nest. We've been in the same job for 20 years. The children are gone. We look to our partner and are like, how did we end up here? So if you've ever heard, yeah, that's what I was just talking about, the sort of notion of this midlife crisis. Doesn't always have to be a crisis, but certainly for some people it is. And then finally, when I'm going to skip through late adulthood and then death. And the thing about death, why is it so scary? Probably because we don't really prepare for it. Most American, I would argue, probably around this culture, death is not something that we talk about, and consequently, we may be afraid of it. We may be afraid of death. We socialize the survivors, but we don't necessarily prepare the person that's dying, and so hence we're afraid of things we don't understand. All in this is another really important term called anticipatory socialization. Anticipatory socialization is a fancy way of saying that we prepare. So, like when you're a child, when you're an adolescent, and your parents get upset with you because you're late everywhere. You're late to school. Maybe you're in high school and you got detention for being tardy, and they say, well, one of these days you're going to have a job and you're going to need to be on time to your job. Well, that's an example of anticipatory socialization. When you need to turn your homework in on time because one of these days you're going to have a boss and they're going to expect you to turn this in on time, or you're going to need to pay your bills. You need to learn responsibility now, young man, so that when you grow up, you're able to do X and Y. That's what we mean by anticipatory socialization. The idea that you're learning things now for a later stage. Here at the college, there's a bunch of examples of it too. The nurses downstairs, even though they sit in a classroom all day, wear scrubs and often have a stethoscope. They don't need to wear those scrubs, but what they are preparing for their job, right? They're preparing for a future socialization experience. So they are anticipatory socialization. Okay, so I think I have enough time. Another consideration or important concept here is the idea of re-socializing. So sometimes when you go through these different stages of the life course, you have to learn new ways. But there are other more profound or radical experiences of re-socialization. And these might be when we participate in a total institution. So here you have like an illustration of boot camp. A total institution is an organization that completely controls your experience, right? So if you are at boot camp, you're told when to get up, when to go to bed, what to wear, what you can eat, when you can eat, who you can talk to, how you can talk to them. And in this sense, you're being re-socialized. Prior to entering boot camp, you go through something called a degradation ceremony, and that's where your identity is stripped away. Your civilian clothes get traded in for your greens. Your hair gets cut. All of your personal effect is removed because your old self is being replaced by your new self, your re-socialization experience. Other examples that are less where you do less building up of the person would be like when you go to prison. When you go to prison, it's a total institution. All your personal identity is stripped away, and you learn something new. You learn about a whole new way of being. You are re-socialized, but probably not the same way that you're built back up in boot camp. Okay, I'm going to stop right here, and the next lecture will be the last one.